would look. And today we're going to talk about evangelism. And I want to talk about evangelism in a very specific way, because I think a lot of us have got a wrong idea about evangelism. A lot of us think that evangelism is the pastor's job, or it is a missionary's job, but it's not all the rest of the Christian's job. I found this quite funny when I came for my interview. One of the questions that was asked by Okkert of Yugi, he asked, so what are you going to do to reach the colored people in Yugi? And I said, nothing, it's not my job to do it.
A deathly silence around.
But it is not my job to do it. My job is to teach and to preach, and evangelism I do as part of my normal Christian life. The thing is, it is all believers' work to evangelize. Every single believer is a missionary. If you read the scriptures, you find that is their task to do. It's not centralized in one person. You might find an evangelist who's got a special gift for it, but in general, every single believer should be a missionary. Every single believer should be an evangelist. And actually, in the church as a whole, there should be a culture of evangelism. It should be part of who we are constantly. So what I want to do is I want to first take you to a whole bunch of scriptures to show you that the emphasis on evangelism lies with every single believer. During our working through those texts, I'll highlight a bit here and there, and then I want to talk about how that type of evangelism would look practically in a situation. Okay, so before I look at the verses, who is afraid of evangelism? I am. Yeah. It's every single time I do evangelism, it's difficult for me. It's not a thing that comes naturally to me. I worked under an older pastor that just spoke to everyone. We'll stand in the queue at the bank and everybody will know the gospel by the time we're out of it. And it just sort of came like second nature to him. I would say he was an evangelist. But for me, it doesn't come naturally. I have to really work at it to evangelize people. And it's something you have to learn to do. But it's something you have to learn to do. It's part of what it means to be a Christian. So the first verses I want to take you to is in Acts 2. We're going to jump around a lot today again. Acts 2, verses 42 to 47. So in this section in Acts 2, we see almost like a snapshot, a photo of the early church, how they looked and how they functioned. And it's very interesting to look at it. So Acts 2, verses 42. It says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of the bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and miraculous signs were done by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common, selling their possessions and goods. They gave to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes, ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So the picture here is of the early church. And it's an interesting picture because we see a community that's completely different than the community around them.
Oh, sorry, how would the traditional community gelyk?
So die gemeenskap op binne hulle gewoon het, daar was Jodendom. So dit sou gewees het die Fariseërs en die Sadduseërs en 'n baie individualistiese tipe kultuur op hulle eie. En hier ontstaan hierdie wat hulle baie tyd het gedink het 'n sekte is wat absoluut omgee van mekaar. In diepte van mekaar omgee. En daai omgee was anderste as enigiets in die kultuur rondom hulle. Dit het net nie vergelyk om nie. Soveel so dat hierdie ouens het saam tyd spandeer. Hulle was gasvry gewees teenoor mekaar. Hulle het saam geëet. Hulle het vir mekaar gesorg, selfs van hulle eie besittings ontslaag geraak soms tyd vir ander te gee. Jy weet, dit was 'n snaakse kultuur, dit was vreemd. Daai eerste frase waar dit sê everyone was filled with awe. Daai everyone daar is nie die Christene nie. Dis almal rondom. Hulle was verbaas. Hulle kon nie verstaan hoe kan hierdie kultuur verstaan? Hoe kan hierdie groep so bestaan? En dit was wat gemaak het op die einde van die dag dat mense bygevoeg is. Was hierdie vreemde kultuur, hierdie snaakse groep wat bymekaar was. If I have to explain it to you, and I think this is the thing we miss. We think that evangelism in the first place is individual evangelism, but it isn't. Evangelism in the first place is a group activity. It's believers together evangelizing. Yeah, you'll evangelize on your own, but you're always doing it as part of a community of believers. And the reason is this. There on the wall is the fruit of the Spirit. So I've got a question for you. If I drop you on an island on your own, can you live the fruit of the Spirit?
Not really, because there's nobody to show it to.
Yeah, so the fruit of the Spirit is dependent on other people around you. You can't be loving if there's not somebody to love. You can't be patient if there isn't someone who's making you angry. You can't be kind if there's not someone to be kind to. The fruit of the Spirit only works in community. We only see the life of the gospel when we are together as a community. And that life together as a community is what brings people in. They want to be there. I've had a friend who was an atheist that attended our Friday night youth in Vryheid, our young adults Friday nights. And that was a Bible study. It wasn't games, it was just Bible study. And he never missed it. And he's an atheist. He doesn't believe in God at all. And the reason, I asked him once, why do you come? He said, well, because you guys are so kind. He couldn't understand how can people be so kind. So he came there because he wanted that kindness. That eventually brought him to Christ. Because it came from somewhere. And he wanted to know where it came from. So that community is what caused it. And the first picture we see of the church was they were a real community. They were living out the fruit of the Spirit.
When was this? After hours?
Say,
When were they living out this lekker life?
right?
Were they still working?
Yeah, they were still working.
Feels like
still
we should
working.
get back to this and just retire.
No,
And
this
be
was
all together and
happening.
do nothing.
No, so this was happening while they were working. So, for instance, when you read Corinthians, says the problem of the people that were richer eating up the communal food before the poor people came, and Paul had to address that issue because everybody was still working. So by the time they got there, they also needed food. You know? So this happened while they were working. It was part of their everyday life. Okay.
So husband and wife go together.
Yeah. Okay. But let's continue. So that just shows a picture of how the early church was, and it was all the believers that were together evangelizing in a way. But let's go to Matthew 28, to the important verse. Matthew 28 from verse 16, the Great Commission.
Janus, het die tyd, kan ek 'n ander vraag vra wat nie
Ja.
regtig betrekking het.
You come up with?
Ek is nou besig om Handelinge te lees,
Ja.
maar ek het so ek nou onlangs met hierdie gelees, daai stuk waar hulle die twee hulle grond verkoop
Ja.
en jok oor die bedrag. Ek sukkel om te verstaan hoekom hulle moes dood. Dit was hulle grond. So okay, so hulle kon dit verkoop. Ek verstaan hulle het gejok.
Die
So
jok was
dit was oor die jok.
Ja.
Okay, maar hoekom sou hulle die need gevoel om hulle grond te verkoop as hulle nie regtig dit wou doen nie? Ek verstaan die pressure wat daar was. Ek probeer net die setup verstaan. Hoekom het hulle gevoel hulle moet hulle grond verkoop en dit vir die ander gee, maar hulle wou nie eintlik.
Ja, hulle probeer beter lyk as wat hulle was. Peter sê julle kon die grond verkoop het vir wat ook al julle wou. Julle het nie eers nodig gehad om te verkoop nie. En as julle dit verkoop het, kon julle gesê het, ons hou soveel terug en gee soveel. Maar hulle het probeer om te
So net die
lyk.
leen.
Ja, hulle het probeer om te lyk asof hulle iets is wat nie regtig is nie.
People come to church, you don't want to come to church.
Okay.
The job depends on people.
Okay, so the Great Commission we find in Matthew 28 from verse 16. I'm going to read from verse 18. So this was just before Christ ascended into heaven. He says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Now, a lot of times when you hear this verse, people will say, oh, but see, this was only for the disciples. But there's two problems for me with that. The one is, yes, he commands the disciples to go and make disciples, and then he says, teach them everything, or to obey everything that I have told you to do. Didn't he just tell them to make disciples? Well, then they have to make disciples. And their disciples have to make disciples. It just continues on. And the second thing is, he says, I will be with you always to the very end of the age. If it was just meant for those disciples, he could say, I'll be with you for 40 years. But he's saying, I'll be with you right to the end. Don't worry. In other words, it's pointing to all disciples into the future. So every Christian that was made is to obey Christ and make more Christians. With the knowledge that Christ is Lord over everything, he's got all authority, and that he is with you. You're never alone. He is with you till the end. You don't have to worry. So you can do this. Yeah. The next verse I want to take you is in 1 Peter chapter 2. First Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. This is two of my most favorite verses in the Bible about the Christians. So 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. So this is a description of the Christians, of who they are. It says, but you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. So to understand this, you have to understand the idea of a priest in the Old Testament. So if you lived in the Old Testament and you were to pray to God, would he hear your prayers? Maybe, maybe not. How could you be certain that he would hear your prayers? Well, you'd have to go to a priest, and you would have to have a incense offering made, and then your prayers with the incense would go up to God and would be acceptable. But you needed the priest sort of as an intermediary between you and God. Now, he says, we are a royal priesthood. In other words, we are the ones who become our own intermediaries. We have access to God. We can just pray and we are with him immediately. As Baptists, we believe in the priesthood of all believers. And what it means is that every priestly function becomes each one of our functions. In other words, who is allowed to do a baptism?
Any Christian.
Any Christian. Who is allowed to give the communion?
Any Christian.
Any Christian.
I believe that.
Yeah, you're a priest. Every single Christian is a priest. Who is allowed to express the gospel? Every single one of us. And that's precisely the thing that he then focuses on here. He says, you are all of these things. And he says, a people belonging to God that may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. So as priests of God, our task is to proclaim the praises of God, his glory, in that he saved us. He took us out of darkness into light. Isn't that expressing the gospel to people? In a very practical way, this verse would mean we are to give our testimonies to people. We are to tell people who we were, who we are now, and how God did it, how he's the one who broke the change. So that is part of what it means for us to be priests for our God. We are to express this truth. Okay. Let's return to Acts. Acts chapter 8. Acts chapter 8, verse 4. So up until this point, the church the Christian church was basically in Jerusalem. It was settled in Jerusalem. It was seen as a sect of Judaism, and it was just stuck in this one place. And it wasn't going further. So if you God, how do you make it go further? You bring persecution to the church. So everybody runs out of Jerusalem to other places. And what happens when they move?
Proclaim the gospel.
They proclaim the gospel. Listen to this. Those who had been scattered, so this those doesn't reflect to the apostles, it reflects to all the Christians, everyday Christians. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. They just kept on preaching it wherever they went. It was part of their nature to do this. And then we have an example. Philip went down to the city of Samaria and proclaimed Christ there. When the crowds heard Philip and saw the miraculous signs he did, they all paid close attention to what he said. With shrieks, evil spirits came out of many, and many paralytic and cripples were healed. So there was great joy in that city. So as the Christians moved out because of persecution, they just kept on proclaiming the gospel where they went, each and every one of them. And as they proclaimed, what happened? Well, it was followed with miracles, and it was followed with these displays of power. God was proving his gospel. And at the same time, it filled the people with joy. This is our work as believers. We should be doing it. If there is persecution here and we flee to other towns, you should end up having churches in other towns, because that's what we do as Christians. I don't know if you know about the 1830 settlers, German settlers. So the Baptist church in Germany was actually started just a bit before they came this way by a man called Johann Gerhard Oncken. And Johann Gerhard Oncken had a motto. And the motto was, every Baptist is a missionary. Elke Christen is a sendeling. And he really, I almost want to say, indoctrinated the German Baptists with that. They believed this very strongly. They were very reformed, but this is something they believed very strongly. Then there was a battle between Germany and England. And Germany lost. The English decided they're not sending the troops back because they will just revolt again. So they gave each of them a piece of property in the Cape Colony, the Eastern Cape, and dropped them off here at one of the harbors, and the guys had to sort of fend. They were paid for 3 years. And in that group that was dropped, there was 300 Baptists. Those 300 Baptists, 4 years later, wrote a letter to Johann Gerhard Oncken and said to him, we are in dire need of a pastor. We don't have a pastor. We've got people who need to be baptized, and we don't have a pastor. Please send your best. He then sent Hugo, what's his name, Oncken, to come. Decided it was his own secretary. When Oncken came and landed on land, that same day he landed on land, he had to baptize 600 people that were waiting for him to be baptized. The 300 Baptists that came in at that time stood at about 3,000 Baptists, because they believed in each one of them being a missionary. And what did they have to do? Proclaim the gospel.
Life was dangerous then, wasn't it?
Extremely dangerous.
That would have brought more of them to the Lord.
Yeah, but I think they still had to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm just saying that it's easier to evangelize when people are in danger.
Like today. But yeah, so this was part of their culture. And I think that is part of what the New Testament expects of us. Every single Christian is a missionary. Every single Christian has to evangelize. It's part of who we are. It's our DNA as Christians. We have to do this. The early church did precisely that. Let's turn to Philippians. Philippians 2.
Who is supposed to evangelize to?
Everyone. So we'll look at that just now. Okay. Philippians 2, verse 14 to 16. So here, Paul is asking the Philippians to imitate Christ. And then he has this beautiful section where he says, do everything without complaining or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure children of God, without fault in a crooked and depraved generation, in which you shine like stars in the universe as you hold out the word of life, in order that I may boast of the day of Christ, that I did not run and labor for vain, for nothing. Okay, so what a beautiful picture. Where are we living as Christians? In darkness. The world in which we live is full of corruption. It's full of darkness. It's full of sin. This is the world in which we live. But in this world, we as Christians are to be shining stars. We are to be lights in this darkness. And we're lights specifically, he states here, when we hold out the word of life. In other words, the gospel to people. That's our task. We're supposed to shine bright like stars, but we shine bright like stars when we are giving out the gospel to people. And he says that the whole world is covered in darkness. Is there anybody that we should not be proclaiming the gospel to? We should be proclaiming it to everyone. Everyone that is in darkness needs the gospel, needs a light, and we should be proclaiming it. Okay. Does that make sense? Yeah. It fits with what Christ said, that we are light and salt. It's the same idea. Paul just makes it more specific by stating we do that specifically by living out the gospel to people. Okay. Let's go to Peter again. 1 Peter chapter 3. I'm going to read from verse 13, but verse 15 is the important one. So Peter writes to the Christians in the diaspora, the Christians who are living between unbelievers, and that are against them, set against them. That's the whole theme of the book of Peter. These Christians are suffering because they are living in this situation. So who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear what they fear, do not be frightened, but in your hearts set apart Christ as Lord, always being prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping clear conscience, so that those speaking maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. So here you have these Christians living amongst unbelievers who really are slandering, causing suffering for them. And Peter said, it's better to suffer when you don't deserve it than it is to suffer when you deserve it. And you guys aren't deserving it, so it's better Christ. It's like Christ suffering. And then he says, but what you should be doing in that time is not become negative and say, why am I always suffering? What you should be doing is sanctifying Christ as Lord in your heart. In other words, make Christ everything for you. He must be the center of your life that you live out. And then what happens? Well, then all of a sudden you've got hope. You act differently towards your suffering because, well, you've got this living hope inside of you. And then people were going to ask you, how can you keep on doing good? How can you keep on staying positive when everything's just going negative around you? How can you keep on going when you're suffering? And at that moment, you have the chance to say, this is why. And you explain Christ to them. Yesterday, I read a small biography about Charles Simeon. He was a pastor in the late 1800s and a very interesting guy. But he ended up in a church that didn't want him. And he stayed there for 50 years. So it was really bad. For the first 5 years, the people wouldn't attend his morning service, which he did. And the evening service was at their discretion to place someone. So they originally had Dr. Hammond take the evening services. After 5 years, Dr. Hammond retired. And instead of getting Simeon to preach the evening services, they got for another 7 years people from other places to come and preach the evening services. That was not even the worst. So at that time, people paid for their pews. And what the people did is they went and they locked up their pews so that nobody could use it. but they didn't themselves attend church. So the people who attended church had to stand in the halls between the rows. And that went on for 27 years before it changed. So this was his life. He had immense suffering. It was really bad. And just before his death, one of his friends asked him, Charles, how did you keep going? And he said, it's good for us sometimes to take light suffering for Christ.
Right.
Light suffering for Christ. And then when you read his biography, everybody just said he never became negative. He was always smiling, always friendly towards the people around him. Even his enemies, he was friendly. Eventually, he won them over 27 years later. But he kept on going. He kept on doing that. That's a type of thing that makes people ask, how on earth do you keep going? And the answer is Christ. It's absolutely just Christ. So that is part of evangelism. It's living in such a way that Christ is your all, that people can see it.
It's only Christ if you surrender to Christ.
Yes, yeah, that sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart, or set Christ apart as the only Lord in your heart. That's the idea of sanctification with him. Okay. 1 Thessalonians 1 verse 8. So Paul writes to the Thessalonians, and it's so interesting. He is really glad for their faith. He has to address some issues, but their faith is something that he really feels proud about, and he commends them for that. He says in verse 6, you became imitators of us and of the Lord. In spite of severe suffering, you welcomed the message with joy given by the Holy Spirit. And so you became a model to all the believers in Macedonia and Achaia. The Lord's message rang out from you, not only in Macedonia and Achaia. Your faith in God has become known everywhere. Therefore, we do not need to say anything about it. So here you've got this church that went through suffering. They gladly received his message because they received it in real suffering. Paul had to run away from the town because they were after him. But their faith was of such a way that it became the thing that converted many others. Now, it's important to realize that Paul, when he proclaims the gospel to people, when he works, he always worked with a plan. So, in the end of Acts, Paul says, I've proclaimed the gospel to the whole of Asia. Okay. But did he? Not really. We know which churches he went to, but he didn't go to all the churches. But what he did is he went to all the major towns. And he would proclaim there. And then the idea was when those Christians there were settled, they would proclaim the message out to the area around. That's what he's commending them for. He preached in Thessalonica. They came to faith. And their faith brought the area around them to Christ. That is amazing. I love that there's a strategy. Paul didn't just say, I'll just evangelize everyone. When he came to a place, he had a pattern that he followed. He first went to the synagogues and then to the Greeks, and he had this whole pattern that he followed. But he always went to all the places where he knew if the gospel was settled there, it would flow down to the smaller towns. And that's how he worked. But here again, the believers and their way of life becomes the thing that convinces other people of it. Their faith under suffering helps the believers. Okay. Let's go to, just the previous page, Colossians chapter 4, verses 4 to 6. Here Paul asks the Colossians to pray for him, and then he turns it around back on them. I like it. He says, so remember Paul is in Rome in prison when he writes to the Colossians. So he's going to appear before the Roman court very early on after this. So he says, pray that I may proclaim it clearly. That's the gospel, as I should. Be wise in the way you act towards outsiders, making the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. So there's two things here that's striking. The one is that Paul realizes that evangelism is not just the speaking of something. He asks them to pray for him so that he will be able to speak the right things. We tend to think that evangelism begins the moment we speak to someone. Evangelism begins quite a long way before that, when you identify the person that you want to speak to, and then you spend time preparing the ground for the message to come. You pray, and you pray, and you pray, because you know that God is the only one that changes people. So you just keep on praying. And then God gives you the opportunity to speak to them. And he gives you the words to say. And you're ready to handle it. That's the one side of it. And I think we don't make enough of that type of prayer, or strategic prayer. The other side of it is that Paul wants them to make use of every opportunity. So he almost wants them to be like bloodhounds, just running off to the scent. Every time they find an opportunity to speak about Christ, they're supposed to use it. And they're supposed to do it in such a way that, he says it so beautifully, he says, let your conversation always be full of grace, seasoned with salt. In other words, it needs to be pleasant. It needs to be good. You want people to take the gospel. So you're not being nasty to them. You give it in a good way, and graciously to them. But you make use of every opportunity. So if you look at your own life, even just today, how many opportunities would you have had to speak to people about the gospel? And how many of those opportunities did you use? For most of us, it's very seldom. We are so busy running through life that we don't get to that. And I think that the main problem is that the gospel isn't, or evangelism hasn't become for us a priority. It's one of those things we need to do, but it's not the thing we need to do. As a church, that's the thing we need to do. It should be our main priority, to evangelize. And then your life should flow towards that. I read a biography of Hudson Taylor, busy with a few friends reading through his biography at the same time. And Hudson Taylor structured his whole life from the moment that he realized he's going to China. He wants to go to China to proclaim the gospel there. He structured his whole life for that. He changed his diet so that he could eat more rice, so that he could get used to it. Slept on the floor, things like that, so that he was ready to do that. He was still studying medicine, but with a purpose. He wanted to go to China, and being a doctor would be something that would help him to do that. If we look at our lives, do we structure our lives in a way that evangelism is the purpose of our lives? And the answer is no, we don't. But it should be. It should be how we think about it. Okay. Now, everything we've done so far is New Testament. You might say, okay, that makes a lot of sense. But the Old Testament was the same story. I'm going to take you to two Psalms to show you that. The first Psalm is Psalm 51. It's the Psalm that David prayed just after he got caught out by Nathan. And I want to read to you verses 12 and 13. Psalm 51.
Nathan caught out in terms of?
Met Bathsheba.
Oh.
Ja. So
Nathan is die profeet.
Nathan is the prophet, yeah. So this is the prayer that he prayed after that. In verse 12, he says, restore to me the joy of your salvation and grant me a willing spirit to sustain it. So forgive me and return me to my place. And then he says this, then I will teach transgressors your way and sinners will turn back to you. So what is his purpose? His purpose is that he wants to teach others what God has done for him. Save me and I will tell others what you have done for me. And this sort of feels strange. Now, this is David. So did he mean other Jews? And I don't think so. I think he meant much wider than that. And the reason for that is is Psalm 96. Psalm 96, verse 7. So we tend to think that Israel was sort of this unique group that had to isolate themselves from the rest of the world. But when you read Deuteronomy, you realize that God created them as a unique group, yes, but to be a testimony to the rest of the world and bring them in. And he actually tells them, if you are not going to bring the nations in, I will shatter you among the nations. And that's what he eventually does to them. Listen to Psalm 96. Ascribe to the Lord, O families of the nations. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due to his name. Bring an offering and come into his courts. Worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness. Tremble before him, all the earth. Say among the nations, the Lord reigns, and the world is firmly established. It cannot be moved. He will judge the peoples with equity. This is broad. This is, everybody should proclaim this of God. We need to get everyone to realize that God is the living God. This was the purpose of Israel. They were supposed to be a community that brought the outsider in to God. And we as a church in the New Testament is that very community. We are supposed to bring the outsiders in. If I can explain it to you in a different way, I would do it this way. In Israel, there was a temple. First a tabernacle, and then a temple, and it got broken, and then another temple, and it got rebuilt again, and then another temple, and it was destroyed in 75 after Christ. If you were a Jew, you would bring people to the temple. You want them to see God. Magnificent temples, but you would want them to see God. Do Christians have a temple? We are the temple of God. We are his holy house. If we want to bring outsiders in, where do we bring them?
The house.
Into our community, into our houses, into our lives. That's how we're supposed to do it. And that's what we read in the New Testament. We are supposed as Christians to be hospitable, bringing the outsiders in, bringing even strangers into our houses and feeding them and looking after them. So much so that in Hebrews it says, by doing it, some of us might even bring angels into our house without even knowing it. If you read 1 Timothy and you read Titus, you find that one of the things that an elder must be, one of his elements of elder, is that or attribute of an elder is that he is hospitable, that his home is open to outsiders to come in and learn. The only way we can really show people the Christian faith is by bringing them into our houses, into our lives, having them spend time with us and see the faith in action. I've told you previously about Rosmara Butterfield. She was an English professor, very liberal. She was a lesbian, and she was for women's rights. You could keep on the list. And one day she wrote an article, and it was published, and it was against the evangelical church and their stance on homosexuality. And she says she received a bunch of letters. Half of it was pro for what she wrote, and the other half was very negative and bad, and she expected both of those. And then she received a letter from a pastor in the very town where she lived, and the pastor wrote her, and she said she didn't know what to make of the letter. He didn't agree with her, but he wasn't nasty. So she didn't know how to handle it, and he invited her to come to them for dinner. So she went on a Sunday afternoon for dinner. And after the dinner, he said, well, we're going to have our evening songs now and a Bible study. Do you want to stay? And she stayed, and she sang along, and she read the scriptures. And she said the strangest thing for her was that everybody there didn't agree with her, but everybody there loved her. And she went back week after week after week, every Sunday. They became friends, and eventually she came to faith. That's the type of community we should be. A community that doesn't judge, but shows that type of love. are honest enough to say to someone that what you are doing is wrong. The Bible's very clear on it. But that doesn't mean that we don't want you to be saved. We still want you to become part of the household of God. The change will come when He brings the change. But that type of community is what we need to be. And that's the type of community we ought to bring people into.
A few months ago on RSG,
Yeah.
between 7 and 8, they have stories from Hope and things like that. And they had an article about this pastor, and he had a Muslim come to stay with him. He was evangelist and so on. And this Muslim wanted to know what they were doing and so on. So I invited him to come and stay with him. And he stayed with him for quite a few weeks. And he said afterwards he couldn't understand this. They never tried to bring him to Christ or anything, but they just lived their lives, and he was a guest, and he eventually became a Christian.
Yeah, it's good.
So that's, and he went back. I don't know whether it's Pakistan or Afghanistan, and he went back, and he got to know the Christians in that area.
Yeah.
And his wife thought he was mad. She thought he was trying to entrap her, so she wouldn't go to the church with him or anything because she thought he was going to eat her, and he's trying to trap her so that he can get rid of her, type of thing. It took her 2 years to become a Christian too.
Yeah, amazing. But that's precisely it. We need to bring people in. So our life together becomes the way that we bring people in. That. So sometimes we're afraid to do evangelism because we don't really know where to start, and we're afraid of what people will say. I think the most easiest way of just doing it is just giving your personal testimony. So explain your testimony in terms of who you were, who you now are, and how Christ has brought the change in your life. What can someone say against it? It's your own personal story. It's your own personal experience. There's nothing I can say against it. It's actually such a safe way of bringing the gospel to someone. You're just telling them your story. But I also think that you shouldn't be afraid to say to someone, I don't know. I've got a friend that he had a friend that was a Muslim, and he decided that he's going to explain the gospel to him. He felt very convicted of it, and he started explaining the gospel to him. And this Muslim was ready for it. He just hit him on everything, and he did something amazing. He said to the Muslim, the first issue, he said to him, I don't know. Let's find out together. And just by doing that, it opened the conversation. It kept it open. And it took 3 years before the Muslim eventually became a Christian. But in those 3 years, that friend of mine became like a specialist in Islam. He knows how to answer every question. He knows where because every time he hit a wall, he had to go read up. How do you answer this? How do you answer that? Then he went back. Then the discussion went on a bit. And then this other guy would give a stop again. And then let's go find out. And eventually, he almost exclusively works with Muslims at the moment. He just knows so much about it. If you need help, you phone him. He'll tell you. But I think we need to realize that evangelism is also a way of building your faith. If you evangelize someone, you're going to get a lot of questions, and some of them you're going to get repeatedly. And you shouldn't be afraid of the questions. What I can promise you is that Christians have thought their faith through properly through all the ages. I think we've got the best thought out faith ever. There's answers for everything. And these days we've got the internet. You can really quickly go search. I put some links onto the group where you can go and search. One of them, Apologetics 315, you can actually just go to the topic. So you search the topic you're looking for, and there will be talks that you can listen to, and very, very nice. And what happens is you learn, and your faith gets built up, because now you know a question you've never even thought about. So now you have to go think about it and read, and you find out, and your faith gets built up by it. And now you can help someone, you can have this conversation a bit further. And then what happens? Well, all of a sudden someone else pops out with the same question, and now you're prepared. You can answer it. So don't be afraid to say to someone, I don't know. Let me find out. And then just come back. Just keep the conversation going. Okay. The other thing is in the past, it was possible for you to do year 3 or one of those courses, and you could really take a person from not believing to belief in 2 hours. These days, it's impossible. Most of the people you're going to handle or talk with doesn't even have a basic Christian worldview. They have no idea of what you have. So we need to change the way we think about evangelism. Evangelism isn't a quick 15 minutes and now it's done. Evangelism is something that takes time. It's something that you have to spend time with. And you need to realize that you most probably won't be the person who takes the person all the way through. God is working in the background, and he will bring people across that person's path as is needed. You just need to do what is given for you at that moment. I don't know if you remember with the tactics videos that we watched.
Stone in the shoe. Stone in the shoe.
The stone in the shoe, yeah. Where he used that section in John chapter 4, I think, where the lady is at the well, and then Jesus talks to her, and she runs into town to go fetch people from town. And as they come out, Jesus is talking with the disciples, and he says to them, today you are going to harvest where you haven't sown. And the idea there is that in the Christian life, when we do evangelism, you have someone who sows. Oh, before that, you've got someone who prepares the ground, someone who sows, someone who waters, maybe sometimes repeatedly, and then eventually someone who has the privilege of bringing in the harvest. And you need to realize that evangelism isn't you doing the whole process. You might only do a part of it. Most of my life, I've been the sower. I've just been planting seeds. I very seldom have the privilege of bringing someone to faith. But it's fine, I don't mind. I'm good with sowing, so I'll do that. But we need to think about it that way. The other thing is that you need to realize that God is working throughout. He brings the right people at the right time. Most of the time, you are just going to put a rock in the person's shoe. You're going to get them to just think a bit more about their lives. If there's so many of the young guys here in town that is absolute communists in their life. And I make a point of talking to every one of them that I get a chance with. And I ask them, are you willing to give up all your property? No, that's not how I would explain to them. That's how it works. You say, what if they tell you that your job's going to be cleaning toilets? No, but I'm an artist. Oh, well, you're going to be an artist with a loo busy cleaning it because they decide for you. And they never hear those things. That might not seem like bringing the gospel to someone, but it's breaking down a stronghold that eventually will allow the gospel to come in. That is bringing the gospel. So you need to realize that you might only be doing a bit. That's fine. That's perfect. Just do that bit. And God will make sure it works and runs its path to the end. So I think that's what we need to realize. The other thing is we need to realize that we need to work with a plan. It's very easy for us to think, I'll just evangelize as people come across my road. That's good. You should be doing that. But you should also be working with a plan. Evangelism is work. You have to pray for a person. You have to go and make a chance to go and speak to that person. You have to go through the whole process, and sometimes repeatedly before you have a chance of speaking to that person. And that means it's something that you have to really work at. And remember that the idea is that the community does it. So we shouldn't just be praying alone for someone. You might need to get a few people together and say, I've got this person in mind. I've been praying for them. Won't you pray with me? And then together you work at this person at doing it. The other thing is that we need to use every opportunity. I read a biography a while back of Greg Livingston. He's the guy that basically spearheaded the gospel work to Islam speaking nations or the Islam nations. A very interesting guy. If you ever want to watch his talk on desiring God, it's wonderful. But his whole life was set on this one thing that he needed to do. He realized he needed to get young people over there to bring the gospel to them. And he and his wife changed their whole life to do it. They moved to places where it would be most efficient for them to do their work. They would live in other people's houses while they were gone on leave or whatever, so they didn't have to spend money on rent, so they could take the money for the rent and spend it on tracks and getting other people overseas and stuff like that. Their whole life was built around this idea of let's get people to these countries that need it. And I think our lives should be the same also. We should use every opportunity. A lot of times we shoot ourselves in the foot. We'll say stuff like, a Christian is not supposed to buy from a Pakistani. I would say a Christian is not just allowed, but must buy from a Pakistani, and often, and make sure you buy from the same one and get to know his name, get to know his family, where they are from, and make sure you become friends so that you have the opportunity to bring the gospel to him while he's in a country where he's allowed to do it. So you should be using every opportunity, but then also you should be using your life as a whole. If hospitality is the way that we bring people in, then you need to budget so that you can bring people into your house to eat. Or you need to make sure you're at places where you can show that type of hospitality. Evangelism is something that becomes our whole life. It's a lifestyle as believers. It's who Christ has called us to be, and that's who you should be. And don't be afraid of it. The most wonderful thing is that Christ promised the disciples that he will be with them when they're in front of the courts. He will give them the words that they need. So many times I've been in places where I've had to evangelize with someone or speak with someone about the gospel, and then I talk about it, and afterwards I think, what a stupid thing that I say there. And then later on, you find out that was precisely what the person needed to hear. You, it sounds like I just made a mess. And for them, it was just the right thing. And we need to realize that also. And if you really want to see the Spirit at work, evangelism. Be there where God shows his power most. There. We don't see languages really being spoken in church. And the reason is there's nobody there that needs to hear it. But go to places where there's people with different languages that needs to hear the gospel. And there you see the gift of languages everywhere. That's where we need to be if you want to see that type of thing. So, so that's what I want to say about evangelism. Is there any questions? Or
Who do we evangelize to?
Everyone.
But everyone is what someone mentioned here, unbelievers earlier. Is it unbelievers?
Yeah.
Not believers.
You can't evangelize to believers because they already believe.
How do you know they're believers or not?
They'll tell you. You'll see it by the fruit. Yeah.
If you don't see it by the fruit, then you can evangelize.
You can evangelize in any case. Remember that for a believer, to hear the gospel is never a bad thing. We love the gospel and we want to hear it. For a believer to sit and listen to someone else's testimony, it's just uplifting. Because you know it's your testimony to you. It's never a waste if you were to do that. So if you're unsure, tell the gospel. Maybe you'll hear the gospel back, and then you know. This person knows. But if you think the person doesn't know, just evangelize. No?
Control your group. Go to the same one every time. Talk to him. Eventually you can talk about the gospel.
But it also shows the way the Lord shapes us and makes the path or opens the path for us. Last year, March, we got the news that my brother-in-law was a match for Eileen.
Yeah.
We were all together for a reunion, and Linky was also there. And she said to me, I'm glad he's a match, but the Lord told me I'm going to give her a kidney. And then it worked out. My brother-in-law was not allowed to do it or anything. Phoned her and she said, I told you. And she gave her a kidney.
Yeah. That's amazing. Ja. Ja.
When I give out the newspaper, the Holy Spirit sometimes tells me what to say. Because like Jana said, sometimes it's nonsense.
That makes.
That's why I have the presence of the Holy Spirit. That's one of the reasons why I continue to do the thankless task.
It's also important to work with people and, you know, and acknowledge what the Lord's doing in your life. Because even with unbelievers or anybody, I often say, yes, but the Lord is with us, or the Lord helped me, or things like that. And I sometimes get funny looks.
But what really caught me out one time is I was really afraid to sort of just in general conversation talk about Christ and things like that. And then one day I was in a conversation with a guy whose wife sells essential oils. Oh my goodness. And every bit of the conversation was about how you could use essential oils. If you say, oh, I sometimes get sinus, then he lists the stuff that you can use for it. And then afterwards I thought, nobody has an issue with that. But they have an issue when you speak about Christ, and he's more part of your life than the essential oils would be. So I just decided, well, then I'll just speak about Christ. If they have an issue with it, then whatever. And it works. Wow. Yeah. Okay, let's close our eyes and pray together. Father, thank you that you have called us out of darkness into light, and that we can be your family. More than that, that we can be your priesthood, that we have this privilege of bearing the light of your word, this wonderful gospel that you have given us, Lord, that we can bear that light into this dark world. Help us, Lord, to make use of every opportunity, to buy out every moment that we have, and make sure that your word is spread widely and deeply into the hearts of men. Father, help us as a community to be such a living example of the fruit of the Spirit, that people will come and be in our midst and don't want to leave until they've heard about Christ. Thank you for your goodness towards us, Lord, and that you love us so greatly. We pray this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you. See. See. Oh,